All right, let's get moving here to finish up this long chapter that I've had to now break out into 4 parts so far. I think that this will be the last one, I should hope. And where we left off last time, we were talking about these different theories, feedback and feed forward control of movement. And we kind of suggested here that there could be some problems with both of these theories, really. For one, the feedback theory is one that seems to make a lot of sense when we explain our slow, careful movements towards an object, like I'm carefully reaching to pick up something, right? But I also described these kinds of feedback movements as ones that are necessarily slow because it takes time to process the feedback information, and they may be somewhat of a load on our processing resources in the central nervous system. The idea that I talked about is that the alternative of feed-forward control or open loop control is one that is sometimes used to describe just performing very fast and simple movements. But there's also this theory that suggests that over time, as we practice a movement and become very, very good and skilled at it, that this kind of skill acquisition involves transitioning from that kind of slow, controlled, feedback-driven approach to a more top-down feed-forward approach involving what we call a motor program, right? And the idea is that over time, we fine-tune these motor programs so that we become less reliant on feedback over time. But at the very end of the previous lecture, we also talked about how there are problems now with this motor program view because of the idea that there are so many different individually moving parts of the nervous system. And I don't just mean moving parts of the body like the joints, for example, but the control is addressed at the level of motor neurons and muscle fibers, and potentially even smaller than that, the myofibrils and sarcomeres. And so there are tens of thousands, if not more, moving parts in the motor system at any given time. And that's called the degrees of freedom problem, which has places a huge computational burden now for the motor programs to be able to individually manage all of those moving parts. And then there was the other issue of context condition variability, that the relationship between a single motor program in the brain and a given movement outcome is highly variable and nonlinear because movements occur in a variety of different contexts, and therefore simply a command from the brain to tell muscles to contract a certain amount is not necessarily always going to result in the desired movement outcome without also taking into account a huge number of external variables. And so maybe we could find an alternative, and that's where we're going to go next. And this is an important thing for you to maybe take some notes on, because you're not going to find this kind of content in the book here. We'll get back into talking a little bit more about other central nervous system components for motor control as we get back to the end of this set of notes. But this first section here on dynamical systems is kind of a new idea in a way. So that the idea here is that this kind of approach, the dynamical systems approach, is an alternative to what I previously presented as control theory, which is the larger umbrella that includes both feed forward and feedback control. And the idea of a dynamical systems approach to the control of movement is that our bodies are dynamical systems, and that we can use the mathematics of dynamics from physics to account for how we may achieve some degree of stability of movements. This rests on an assumption, though, because dynamical systems frequently involve what might be considered continuous oscillatory kinds of movements. In physics, for example, one of the standard textbook examples of a simple dynamical system that is an oscillator is a mass spring system. The idea is you're supposed to envision a spring with a mass at the end of it, and that mass is pulling down on the spring, and it is resting at a given resting length. that is determined by, of course, the stiffness of the spring and the mass of that is attached to the end of it. But if you were to pull that weight down and then let go, that spring is going to bounce up and down several times, and the way in which it oscillates is now a dynamical system, and it oscillates at a given frequency, but it tends to settle back down to its same resting state, which is called an equilibrium state. And this equilibrium, as I said, is determined by things like the mass itself, the stiffness of the spring, as well as the gravitational constant. Another example is a pendulum, right? And you have a weight at the end of a string, and again, you set it swinging like a pendulum, and it will swing at a specific rate that is again determined by actually the length, in this case, of the pendulum, again, as well as the gravitational constant. And there are simple equations that can be used to describe these states. But what's interesting about these kinds of dynamical systems is that because you can describe them with this sort of an equation, that means that their behavior is predictable, right? And the same could be also potentially said about human movements, is that some aspects of human movement are predictable and oscillatory in a way. So for example, on this slide, I have a picture of a person walking there. And the idea is that we might imagine that as we are walking, the legs swing. You put your one foot down as you plant the leg, and the other one swings forward. That's a little bit like a pendulum. And so the pendular dynamics that I have just described could also be used to describe the way in which the legs swing. And of course, if you're walking fast, as this person appears to be, then your arms might also be swinging, and your arms might then also behave as a pendulum as well. And so the movements that we achieve here, now, of course, because we have elbows and knees, our arms and our legs are technically segmented pendulums, which involve a slightly more complex dynamical system to explain their movements, but nevertheless, you can still describe mathematically the behavior of a segmented pendulum. So anyway, because we could describe these movements using the dynamical equations, that is potentially important. And one of the reasons for this is, think back to our pendulum or our mass spring oscillation. These are predictable and regular behaviors that these systems exhibit, and they do so without any feedback or feed-forward control, right? Because they don't have brains, right? So it's the brain in our previous diagrams of these process theories, control theories, where we talked about there being a controller, right? And that controller is the one where we store the motor programs, and that issues these commands and then executes them. And it's that external controller. The technical name for that is called allonomy, right? External control. And pendulums and mass spring oscillators are not allonomous. They are instead autonomous, right? They are self-regulating, self-controlling systems, because they exhibit that behavior as just the inherent function of their internal dynamics without any sort of external monitoring system or controlling system like a brain. And so we might think, okay, so does that mean that as my legs and arms swing while I'm walking, is it possible that the pendular dynamics of these limb segments take over and determine their movements without the need for us to invoke some sort of external controller, such as a brain that has to program each little muscle contraction? Or can we just let the pendular dynamics determine what muscles contract, right? That's partly the idea here as well. But I've included a variety of other actions on this slide just to indicate that beyond this kind of walking, we might engage in lots of behaviors that we might see as oscillatory in some respects. So this guy that's talking, for example, the repetitive continuous movements of the vocal tract occur with some repetition. There is a cyclical nature to that, right? I have a person eating a sandwich here, so she's chewing, and again, there is a repetition or cyclical nature to that, or waving, or brushing your teeth, or shaking hands, or writing. Those are all examples of behaviors that are somewhat repetitive and cyclical and rhythmic in nature. And so again, whenever we see this kind of oscillatory rhythmic behaviors, we might think, can we talk about some sort of a pendulum or other sort of oscillatory dynamical system to explain those actions. Now, the one in the middle there, person is reaching to pick up an apple from a table. Now, reaching to grab an object, I previously described in a way that didn't sound very oscillatory in nature, right? It's you reach and you grab the object and the movement is done, and it's a single discrete action, except for the fact that in many cases, our movements don't really end at that point, right? Because if I'm reaching to pick up an apple, it's likely because I want to bring it back and maybe put it in my mouth to take a bite. And so there is a cycle there, right? As I reach out and then come back. And in that case, then there is an actual rhythm to this. And of course, then I might start eating and chewing, of course, and then I put the apple down for a second and bring it back up to take another bite, and back and forth and back and forth. And so in this way, these kinds of movements keep on keeping on in a way, right? So we might think, yeah, maybe these oscillatory dynamical systems could possibly serve as a model for what the body is doing. And by the way, another important point to add on this topic before I shift slides here is that, separate from thinking of the limbs swinging in this way and behaving a little bit like pendulums, as it turns out, our muscles exhibit springy-like dynamics. So if you study muscle tissues, you'll find that muscles behave like springs. And anatomical researchers have done this with animals where they dissect the muscle and hang a weight on it and pull on it, and it stretches up and down and in a way that's very much like a spring does, right? A mass spring dynamic. So it may be the case then that, separate from the pendular dynamics that I was talking about, that mass spring dynamic could also explain something about muscle contraction. So what this may mean then, this is the upshot here of adopting a dynamical systems approach to the control of movement, is that we don't need to have this external controller, right? We don't need to have some external brain that has to worry about. Now, that doesn't mean the brain doesn't play a role in determining the movement and initiating the movement, right? But it's in the unfolding of the movement and how the movement dynamically unfolds once it has been initiated. That's the sort of thing that maybe the brain doesn't have to worry too much about. The goal of the brain here is just to say, select a movement, say, I want to do this, and then the mass spring dynamics and the pendular dynamics of the body sort of take over to govern the details, the low-level details of the execution of the movement. So that means in this case, we don't have to individually innervate, activate, and isolate and control every single muscle fiber, right? Again, the dynamical nature of the movement will govern that part of the thing, right? As I'm repeating right here, again, I said this on the previous slide, that the muscle fibers really have this kind of spring-like dynamics. In particular, they behave as a nonlinear damped spring. So that means that their spring-like nature depends on things such as how long the muscle is, right? When the muscle is longer and stretched, its response will look a little different than if it's contracted. So that's part of its nonlinearity. And there's a certain dampening here, because a dampening factor just basically says that if you imagine, like if you have a mass hanging at the end of a spring and you stretch it out and let it go and let it oscillate up and down, it's going to oscillate at a specific rate. But sometimes if you put something on there that dampens the spring, it will quickly settle back down to its resting state. But an undamped spring might really oscillate for a long, long time before it finally settles back down to its resting state or equilibrium state. And as it turns out, we might be able to dynamically adjust the damping of our muscles so that in some cases our movements are performed in a somewhat stiff, damped way, which might result in these very brief, discrete movements that we sometimes perform. Or sometimes we may let it go oscillate over and over and over again, which result in some of the longer continuous actions that we perform. So this idea that a mass spring always returns back to its resting state, I said it's called an equilibrium state. It's also called a point attractor. And the concept of an attractor is the idea that dynamical systems are sort of drawn into these attractor states, right? So a pendulum will start swinging at a specific rate, and the rate at which it swings is another attractor state, although because if the pendulum is not damped and has no friction or air resistance or anything like that, it'll technically swing forever. And that particular kind of state is also an attractor state. For a pendulum, it's called a limit cycle, right? And the idea is that a pendulum will always swing at that specific rate. And even if I were to come along and give that pendulum a little kick to make it swing a little faster, it will slow itself back down and return back to its regular equilibrium swing rate. So it manages always to return back to that particular state. That's why it's called an attractor state. But in the case of the pendulum that swings like that, that's a limit cycle attractor. In the case of a mass spring that comes back to its resting length and stops right there, that's a point attractor. It stops at a fixed point instead of in a fixed cycle the way the pendulum does. So we might now suggest here that if we talk about these two different kinds of attractor states, point attractors and limit cycle attractors, that we could explain both simple, discrete movements as point attractors and repetitive oscillatory movements like walking as limit cycle attractors. And what we're going to suggest here is that all that really has to be controlled from the brain's perspective now is to change in the case of the point attractor, to change the resting length of the mass spring dynamic. Right. So imagine, for example, if there was some way that you could hit a button on your mass spring that suddenly changed its resting length, what would happen is that spring would just suddenly shift its length. And that's potentially what happens with a single discrete reaching movement, for example, is that by dynamically adjusting the resting length of the mass spring system of the muscles controlling the arm, then suddenly those muscles just automatically change their length. And the details of how that length change occur, again, is handled by more peripheral mechanisms involving some stretch reflex mechanisms within the spine. But outside of that, then the movement really just unfolds on its own. And that's where the autonomous side comes in. So there is a little bit of a role of allonomy here. Allonomy is happening because the brain determines what the current resting length of the muscle ought to be. But the autonomous side of it is that the details of movement execution are really regulated at more peripheral levels here, from the spine out to the musculature. The same could apply to limit cycle attractors. Like if I'm walking, for example, and I want to pick up the pace and walk a little faster, then I could somehow just change the limit cycle dynamic of my legs as pendulums, and maybe I go a little bit faster. In the previous lecture, I spoke about horses with different gaits, for example, the rack and the trot and the gallop and these sorts of things. And again, we could say that maybe there are different, not just limit cycles for each limb, but also different phase relationships between these limit cycle oscillators of the different limbs. And again, the brain just sets those states and the legs just do the work. Right. These graphs that I have here illustrate what I mean by a limit cycle and a point cycle. So on the top here, the limit cycle shows, if you can see, there is a dark line here. There's a little line arrow pointing to it from the word limit cycle here. There is a thick dark line that represents a perfect circle. So this is a graph that's referred to as a phase portrait, or it's a graph in phase space. The x-axis is x, and that's position. The y-axis is labeled x dot, and x dot here refers to the first derivative of x, and that would be velocity. All right, so if the first, change in position over time is velocity, right? So we're looking at a plot of velocity against position. So we're thinking of how the limb is changing over time. I'm hoping that you can see my mouse pointer here. I have it on the far left of the circle where that dark circle meets the y-axis. And so imagine we start swinging our leg/pendulum. What's going to happen is that we start going up the circle towards the top center of the graph, and it picks up velocity. That's what this graph is showing here, is that as we move up the y-axis, we are gaining velocity as the leg is swinging from left to right, right? And as it's halfway through, as it meets its halfway point, it hits peak velocity where it crosses the y-axis there. And then it starts to decelerate. It starts to slow down as it reaches the opposite end of its swing. So on the far right-hand side of the graph, we see it reaches its maximum deflection to the other side of its positional swing. but it also comes to a brief stop, right? So as the pendulum swings from one side to another, as soon as it reaches the end of its swing, it has to stop in reverse direction. So there is a momentary zero velocity as it now swings back from right to left, in which case now the velocity increases again, although we've gone negative here. We're going to use the sign of velocity just as a convention to indicate the direction of the velocity. So when the velocity goes positive, we're moving from left to right. But when the velocity goes negative, we're moving from right to left. And so again, as it swings back from right to left, it hits peak velocity halfway through and then returns back to where it started and has momentary zero velocity before it repeats the whole thing. And so that behavior of this pendulum is now just moving in this circle. And that repetition of that exact perfect circle is the limit cycle. Now, these other kind of coils all around in here indicate what would happen if we perturb the pendulum, right? So if I go along and I kick it to make it swing a little bit faster, it might swing out a little bit wider and have higher velocities, but it will eventually settle back down into that limit cycle attractor, right? And that's the concept of the stability involved here, is that it will return to that state. Now, the rest of these internal coils indicate more of maybe a point attractor. So a pendulum can be a point attractor if we add in the real world, right? We add in air resistance and friction and loss of energy over time, because there's obviously no such thing as what's the word I'm looking for here? A perpetual motion machine, right? And so eventually it will settle down to just hanging straight down, right? And that's what we would see is over time is in real life, it would actually kind of just cycle back down to a point in the middle. And that's what we're also seeing down on the bottom here. And that one on the very bottom could in fact be our mass spring system. So again, we pull the mass at the end of the spring and it just oscillates up and down, up and down, and up and down, but it just cycles back down to a point. These other graphs here show another way of visualizing the exact same event, right? So over here, this sine wave pattern is a different way of graphing the limit cycle. So what happens, of course, in the sine wave pattern is I've got time over here on the x-axis now, and I have so I'm unwinding the circle in a way by allowing time to just kind of continue on indefinitely over here. And I have now positional deflection on the y-axis. And so now, of course, as the pendulum swings, it deflects to the right and then back to the left and then up to the right and then back to the left. And that's what these peaks and valleys in the sine wave are showing us here, would be the angular deflection and lateral movement of the pendulum bob technically, right? And how that repeats itself in this regular repetitive way over time. And if you remember from trigonometry, there is a fairly simple equation that can be used to describe the sine wave oscillation. Now, that's because, so this is called a time series graph instead of a phase portrait, because it's time unfolding on the x-axis here. I have another time series for the point attractor down here on the bottom. So in this case, you see that, yes, we see the angular deflection of our oscillation that then rapidly just decreases in energy and loses its amplitude as it settles to a point. And then it returns to some fixed point, it stays there indefinitely until we come back and maybe perturb it again. So the idea here is that maybe through dynamical systems, we might be able to achieve some degree of autonomy in motor systems and offload some of the computation that we have considered was necessary when talking about motor programs. Now, what I also want to do to finish up these notes here is I want to talk about some things outside of the motor cortex a little bit here, talk about some other details of movement execution within the nervous system. I said at the very beginning that we would mostly be talking about skeletal muscle and voluntary movement, but I do want to have one brief mention of the fact that there are other movements occurring within the body, of course, right? So we have a lot of involuntary movements, including the heart muscles that beat in a rhythmic way, and various other movements of the respiratory system, the diaphragm moving up and down. And of course, what happens when we have some irritation in the nose and we sneeze, that's another involuntary thing, and irritation in the airways, produces coughing, choking produces gagging. Of course, there's all the movements of the digestive system. So bowel movements, swallowing, vomiting, right? And this all involves some degree of muscle contraction called peristalsis throughout the GI tract. And so there's some degree of motor control that actually has to happen here, but it's obviously not voluntary. So it's regulated by the parasympathetic nervous system, right? That's our rest and digest system. And so in that case, then that means that there are control signals that operate from the medulla, for example. That's one of the main things and main centers of the autonomic nervous system. And other aspects of the limbic system, by the way, because certainly when a fight or flight response takes over, it's going to activate the limbic system. And then in turn, that's going to change some of the hormonal balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And that will do things like increase heart rate and decrease movements of the digestive tract, right? So we'll alter some of that a little bit, right? But there's still that kind of brainstem operation here. But for voluntary movements, in contrast to that, we're going to talk primarily about the primary motor cortex and the frontal lobe of the brain. Here labeled the precentral gyrus. That's the specific location within the brain. If you remember when we talked about the somatosensory system, it was the post-central gyrus, right? So right behind the central sulcus. So here we're right in front of the central sulcus, and the central sulcus is what divides the frontal from parietal lobes. So what happens here is that we have axons in the primary motor cortex, or cell bodies really in the primary motor cortex, but their axons connect down into the brainstem and to what are called the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. And this is our primary pathway for voluntary movement. We had this picture once before in these notes when we were focusing more on the parietal lobe for somatosensory cortex. But again, here we can see in the precentral gyrus, we have the primary motor cortex shown in red here. But also curiously, we have this other dark blue region referred to as the premotor area, and in orange is the supplementary motor area. And so these two other brain regions, when we look at some imaging studies, what we'll find is that at the moment of a execution and initiation of a movement, we see the primary motor cortex is active. But what we also see is the premotor and supplementary motor areas are active immediately just before the primary motor cortex is active. So there's some stuff happening when it comes to deciding movements, for example. So prefrontal cortex is involved here as well. So again, I said this earlier in the previous lecture that the conscious choice that I want to reach out and pick something up originates as a decision, and decision making and that kind of stuff really is happening in the prefrontal cortex. But then the decision to use my right arm versus my left arm and other aspects, higher level aspects of how I might want to perform this movement, that kind of stuff is regulated through the premotor and supplementary motor areas before the primary motor cortex takes over to say, okay, now we're really going to initiate this movement in this specific way, right? And then again, that signal descends down through the brainstem. Here is our map. So I said this about the somatosensory area, and we're going to say it again about the motor area, that it is a map of the body, right? And adjacent regions of the motor cortex correspond to adjacent body parts. And also the size of the cortical area dedicated to a given body part is proportional, not to the size of the body part, but rather to the dexterity. When we talked about the somatosensory cortex, we talked about the sensitivity of that body part, but here we're going to talk about the dexterity of that body part. So notice how much cortex the face gets, right? So the speech articulators, the lips, tongue, and jaw, there's a lot of complexity to speech, and that requires a lot of cortex for that. But of course, the hand gets a comparatively large area of cortex as well. So kind of similar, that mapping to the somatosensory areas. And then let's talk about the pathways further down as we go down through the brainstem. We have two different what are called corticospinal tracts, and that term, just kind of break that down, it means a path in the nervous system, that's what a tract is. It's a pathway within the central nervous system, and from the cortex to the spine, hence corticospinal, right? But we have two worth talking about here. One is called the lateral corticospinal tract, the other medial. If you remember your anatomical terms, lateral means to the sides and medial means to the middle. So in this case, the idea is that the lateral corticospinal tract is a pathway that stays towards the outside of the spine, towards the lateral sides of it, right? And this is signals that primarily are involved in controlling our limb segments, right? So our arms and especially our hands and fingers, and also our feet and toes too, right? And so this pathway shows a lot of this kind of cross-lateralization, right? So the idea is that the signal that originates in the right motor area is going to cross over at the brainstem to the left side of the spine, where it will then go to the left side of the body. It also passes through the red nucleus in the midbrain. We've talked briefly about the red nucleus before, but this is one of the areas within the midbrain that integrates with the cerebellum and some other pathways, and it's very important for learning. And so in this case, motor learning certainly plays an important role in kind of fine-tuning the activity within the red nucleus, and it allows us to remember certain movements. Now, the medial corticospinal tract, this one stays towards the center of the spine, right? And here, this is curious that here, this pathway is a separate pathway, and this is for more controlling the trunk muscles, right? So your abdominal muscles, your back muscles, these things are involved in more of your core movements, right? Sitting up, twisting and turning and bending. These kinds of trunk movements involve a completely separate tract within the nervous system here. And this passes through a different part of the midbrain. Instead of the red nucleus, it passes through the vestibular nucleus. Why is it called the vestibular nucleus? Because it receives input from the vestibular organ. And of course, this makes sense, right? Because the vestibular organ helps us maintain our balance and posture. And this needs to involve primarily adjustments to muscles in our abdominal muscles and our back muscles. These are a lot of our core postural adjustment muscles. I also had talked about the VOR reflex before, right? This idea that our ability to twist and turn our heads and bodies, but keep our eyes fixed on something requires its important interconnections between vision and the vestibular system, but of course also from the twisting and turning of the body itself. So of course the motor signals are really going to be connected to all of this stuff as well. This diagram shows those pathways. So on the left here, we see the lateral corticospinal tract. So we see maybe a signal arising from the motor area there in the top. You notice the downwards arrows, and they're coming down through the basal ganglia. We can't quite see them very well here, but then we come down through the red nucleus of the midbrain, and then down through the medulla, and then again crossing over just below that point to the we're looking kind of a frontal view here, where this would actually be the left cortex that's where the motor signal is originating. So here it would then be crossing over to the person's right half of their spinal cord, and then continuing down to whatever peripheral nerve we're dealing with here. So we're seeing this is called contralateral, right? Now, how do I know that's the case? Because I'm looking at the labeling here of the spine. The front side is labeled the ventral side, and this back is labeled the dorsal side. So that means we're looking face on to a person, right? The ventral is always the front belly side of the spine. Now over here, we're looking at the medial corticospinal tract. So again, a signal coming from the cortex would pass down through the basal ganglia, passes through the midbrain, again, including the vestibular nucleus, even though it's shown a little bit further down here in the brainstem. And then it stays towards the center of the spinal cord, right? As you can see that there, that would be the medial path through the spinal cord, as opposed to the lateral tracts that are shown on the left side here. So let's talk about some of those other areas of the brain besides the primary motor areas, right? So as I've already previously described, the posterior parietal cortex helps give us the spatial information that we need. It's integrating the somatosensory information from the body as with the visual information. And we know that damage to this is just one piece of evidence here, causes some difficulty in the visual regulation of our movements and the use of even the use of visual feedback. So the idea is that, yes, we do occasionally use visual feedback in the control of movements. And in this case, that appears to occur primarily within the posterior parietal cortex, because we know that damage to that really interferes with visually guided movements. As already noted as well in the first half of these notes, the somatosensory cortex is bringing in all of the touch and haptics and kinesthetic information from the body. Prefrontal area is where the higher level decision making, just the mere choice, I want to reach out and pick something up. And as I said, the premotor cortex, this is where some of the early planning is occurring, right? So it's taking information from the parietal lobe to say, okay, where's everything at? Where's the body at currently? If I want my hand to reach out and grab something here, I'm going to use my bottle of fizzy water here. I have to determine, well, where's the bottle? Where's my hand? But in this case, I need to know where's my hand before I send it towards the bottle, because it makes a difference if my hand's over here versus over here, right? And if my hand has different starting positions, that changes the nature of the movement that has to happen. So of course, I need some of that haptic information. And so the premotor areas are going to bring that haptic information in to say, all right, given where the hand is now and given where the object is, how do we want to set up this movement, right? And that information is then sent to the primary motor cortex to actually perform the execution of the movement. Here's a good example of how the premotor area plays an important role in kind of setting up the spatial parameters of a movement. This is some really classic research that's been going on for decades in psychology called Prism adaptation. And there's a lot that researchers have tried to use about this technique to understand how visual information is used in the control of reaching, but also how do we adapt and learn from altered and perturbed visual information. And of course, if we do any kind of imaging studies or EEG studies, we can then see what areas of the brain are involved in this adaptation. Of course, the premotor area shows up here. So what happens is that a person is wearing, you can kind of tell from the picture here, goggles that are equipped with wedge-shaped optical prisms. And what these prisms do is they laterally displace your visual field by some fixed degree to the left or right. So in this case, it's all shifted to the right by, let's just call it 10 degrees, right? A 10-degree angular shift. So everything looks shifted sideways, right? So of course, in the pre-prism exposure, we see, it's a terribly drawn hand there. Somebody is reaching out towards the target object, which is just that little dark circle, and they would do so accurately, right? But when they put on the prism goggles, what we're going to say is the apparent location of the target is now shifted to the right, and that's that kind of a grayish circle now. That's where it appears to be. So what happens, of course, is that you're going to aim your hand for where it appears to be. And what you will discover upon reaching in that direction is that your hand is going to miss the target. And your hand is heading off to the right of where the target actually is. And of course, you're going to have to make a correction and guide it back in there. And if you do this repeatedly, in this case, you see that the person is performing this movement without visual feedback because they're reaching their hand under this little shelf. And that shelf prevents them from being able to see their hand while performing the movement. And they don't get to see the consequence of their action until they get their hand totally under the shelf and stick a finger up there to see if they got it next to that line that they were aiming for, right? And at the beginning of the prism exposure, when you first put the prism goggles on, you're going to miss it by some fixed degree in some direction, right? But then what happens is you repeat this over and over and over again, and you gradually make corrections so that from trial to trial to trial, you have less and less error. And maybe after 10 to 15 tries, now you have adapted to the prism and you can correctly reach for the target. You're accounting for that prismatic shift in locations, right? And that's what we're seeing as the end of prism exposure here is the person has adapted their hand, and they see and feel their hand now in this new position. And then this is a curious thing is what happens is that once you take the prism goggles off, now we start to see errors in the opposite direction. This is called negative after effect, because now you don't just go back to normal functioning, you have to readapt back to the regular viewing conditions, which takes another 10 trials or so. And so the error now is in the opposite direction than it was original. So you have to readapt. And so again, this kind of reorienting of where do I see everything and where do I feel my body in relation to all of that gets messed up while we are wearing these prism goggles, but we can adapt. And as noted, the premotor area plays a pretty big role in managing all of that information and the adaptation stuff that's occurring there. Let's talk about some of the subcortical areas that are involved in the control of movement here. So the cerebellum is important, and we may have talked about this before earlier in the course. It plays some role in balance, and that's been discovered a long time ago, because we know that people with cerebellar damage have a lot of balance problems, but they also show coordination problems, and they have difficulty performing complex sequential actions that have a lot of steps, right? And one of the things that this now teaches us is that it seems to be the case that the cerebellum plays an important role in determining the timing of these steps. When you have a series of movements that you have to perform one after the other, then each one of those individual movements that are part of the larger sequence all have to be timed out appropriately. And once we lose that timing, we can't do these movements quite so well anymore, right? So I just have another list of examples there of things that might require a specific timing to them. And we know that damage to the cerebellum causes some damage to that. But let's talk a little bit more about how this actually happens. So the cerebellum gets a little bit of some of the downward information that's coming from the cortex, right? So as that cortical information is coming down towards the brainstem, some of that is going to be routed through the cerebellum. The cerebellum, though, also receives input the other direction, coming up from the spine, that is sensory input coming in. So there's two inputs here, right? There's the descending motor signal and the ascending sensory signal. So of course, that means that there's some coordination of the sensory motor stuff happening there, right? But in order to achieve a very specific timing, one of the things that we see about the neurons of what's called the cerebellar cortex, which is the outer layer of the cerebellum, is that there's these really interesting geometrical patterns that we can see. And so I just have a list of these cells here. There's two key cells, Purkinje cells, which are kind of like flat, and they are kind of oriented in planes. They're all parallel to each other, layered together in planes of organization. And then there are these parallel fibers which run perpendicular to the planes of the Purkinje cells, but they are also, of course, they have axons that run parallel to each other, which is why they're called the parallel fibers, right? And what happens here is that a signal that's running down these various parallel fibers could be an excitatory signal that will activate the Purkinje cells, but because these parallel fibers are running through these planes, they can activate the Purkinje cells in certain sequences, and that geometrical arrangement of the Purkinje cells kind of will determine the timing and their sequential timing. All right, so let's have a look on this next picture here. You can kind of get a sense here, right? We see the parallel fibers are running crossways, and these fanning Purkinje cells are kind of oriented in a plane, more of a vertical plane in this drawing. And the parallel fibers are running in the horizontal plane, crossways to that. And so as a signal runs down one of the parallel fibers, it can activate those Purkinje cells in specific sequences, right? And so depending, of course, on which parallel fiber is stimulated, that's going to activate a different sequence amongst the Purkinje cells. And so it's in this way that the cerebellum can encode specific sequential patterns here. We might think, for example, when we talked about central pattern generators before, this is a good way to maybe create a central pattern generator, right? Simple rhythmic patterns could be activated through something like the cerebellum. Now, another part of the subcortical structures that's important for motor control is called the basal ganglia. And we may have seen these off and on in some of our diagrams of brains so far, but we haven't said much about them. But the basal ganglia is a cluster of structures kind of surrounding the thalamus just below the cortex. And it's composed of at least these three things, at least these three that we're going to talk about: the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. And let's come over here. It's never very easy to visualize these things inside the brain. Here on the bottom left, we can kind of imagine if the brain was transparent, we can kind of see into that a little bit. But of course, even then, that's not showing it correctly, because here the putamen is being slightly cut away to made invisible with just the dashed lines hinting at where it would be. And actually the same is true for the globus pallidus. So we can kind of see their nesting structure here. So the medial part of the globus pallidus is kind of in there, kind of smaller, and then wrapped around it would be the lateral part of the globus pallidus, and then wrapping around that is the putamen. And then this other more looping structure that wraps all the way around in that kind of semicircle is the caudate nucleus, which also, by the way, when you follow that long tail of the caudate nucleus around, we also find some other structures kind of in that general vicinity, like the amygdala and the hippocampus. But here we also see the labeling here, the subthalamic nucleus and the substantia nigra. These play a role along with the basal ganglia here. But what does it all do? Well, one of the things that happens is that the globus pallidus sends inhibitory signals to the thalamus. And what the thalamus, of course, does is it relays sensory information to the appropriate location in the brain. We already talked about how it has the LGN and the MGN for relaying auditory and visual information, but it also relays that information from those sensory areas of the brain to the prefrontal cortex, where that information might be used for decision-making. So in this case, what we're seeing here is that the globus pallidus is spontaneously active. And because it is spontaneously active, that means it will spontaneously, sometimes randomly, inhibit the thalamus, which will inhibit the flow of information in the brain. But what we also see is that the caudate nucleus and the putamen inhibit the globus pallidus. So if what we're seeing here is this requires us to imagine some double negatives here a little bit, right? That the globus pallidus is occasionally randomly, because of random firings, inhibiting information flow within the brain. When the caudate nucleus and the putamen inhibit the globus pallidus, that means that inhibitory information flow is no longer occurring, and we are now increasing information flow. So if we follow that, right, two negatives make a positive. So in this case, inhibiting the inhibition of the thalamus increases information flow from especially the parietal lobe and occipital lobe into the prefrontal cortex, right? So this now kind of increases the signal strength a little bit of the information used for the control of movement. And this helps us, of course, determine the appropriate amount of force needed to perform a movement. So if I want to perform a movement with a higher force, then I want to have more activation of the caudate nucleus and putamen, and therefore less inhibition. If I want to have a slower, more controlled movement with some degree of less force production involved in that, then maybe I want the globus pallidus to increase its activity a little bit here, so I can generate a higher force impulse from the muscles. We could speculate that this might be where some of that dynamical systems control comes in, right? That maybe something about what this is doing is setting the limit cycle or point attractor dynamics here, but that's pure speculation, I would have to say here. One of the things that's worth noting about this, though, is that, let me come back to this picture right here. Like there, as part of this pathway, is the substantia nigra, which helps kind of regulate some of that flow of information from the basal ganglia down to through the midbrain and brainstem to the motor neurons. And damage to the substantia nigra is associated with Parkinson's disease. And one of the things that we see with Parkinson's disease is some of the movement inhibition that would normally keep the hands from shaking is lost. And then, of course, you see tremors emerge. So the actual tremors that are happening are not because of the brain creating the tremors, but rather it's because the brain no longer has the ability to inhibit those tremors. It's as if those tremors are actually a natural part of kind of some oscillatory stuff happening in the basal ganglia and the thalamus. And these structures can inhibit those tremors so that we have smooth, skilled, coordinated movements normally. But with Parkinson's disease, as this system begins to degrade, as cells within these structures begin to die, that's when we start to see now this loss of the inhibition, and then that results in an increase in movement tremor, right? So, okay, that wraps up now this content for this chapter. All right.